Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm George Blumenthal. I'm the director of the Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education, and I want to welcome you to today's talk. It's going to be very interesting. The title of today's talk is The Polarization in Trust for American Institutions Since 1970. And I think you'll find it a very interesting presentation. Um, this is one of the many presentations that we do at the Center for Studies in Higher Education. We do have a couple of upcoming talks that I want to mention to you before we begin. One will be by Chancellor Carol Christ and Professor David Kirk on the topic of, is free tuition a good idea? That will be on October 21st. And another talk upcoming is by Lande Ajos, and she is the higher education advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom, and she will be speaking on the California Student Aid Commission and thoughts about the higher education budgets in the future. And her talk will be on October 22nd. To RSVP for those talks, simply visit the CSHE website at cshe.berkeley.edu. So today, as I said, we will be hearing about the polarization and trust for American institutions since 1970. We will have the talk that will be given by Henry Brady and Brad Kent. At the end of the talk, there will be an opportunity for questions. If you're viewing this on YouTube, then please ask your questions via the chat feature of YouTube, and I will relay them to the two speakers. So you may need to sign in. You will need to sign in on YouTube with an account. A Google account is fine in order to be able to access the chat feature. But please do feel free to send in your questions throughout the talk. So with that, let me introduce our two speakers. Henry Brady is the Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California at Berkeley, as well as Professor of Public Policy and Political Science. He's worked in the Federal Government Office of Management and Budget in the early 1970s, and he's written on a wide variety of fields, including social welfare policy, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and political participation and voting in Canada, Russia, the United States, and other countries. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and of the American Academy of Sciences. So that's Henry Brady. Our other speaker is Brad Kent. Brad is a PhD student in political science, and he's a graduate student in resident at the Institute of Governmental Studies at Berkeley. He was formerly at the Institute for the Study of Societal Issues. He studies public opinion, voting behavior, and the state judicial selection. And with that, let me turn it over to Brad.
Thanks so much, George. And thanks everybody for being here. We hear that there are a couple hundred people on the stream today. That's exciting. And it's exciting to have so many people interested in our work. Also, more people than we can fit in the IGS library, although I really wish that we could be there. I'm Brad Kent, Thomas Kent on the slide that you see right now. We're going to give you an amended version of a presentation that we gave at the American Political Science Association annual meeting a bit over a week ago. And our larger project is about increasing partisan polarization in trust since 1970 in these ostensibly apolitical societal institutions in America. So we see these sorts of headlines regularly. You may have seen them, you may not have, but to be clear, trust in mass media sinking to a new low, confidence in the police at the lowest in 22 years, trust is collapsing in America. These sorts of headlines cross Google News occasionally, enough that people who pay a lot of attention will already know that. But another very, very familiar result that we see, if I could have the next slide, sorry about that, that we see in public opinion research, many of you will find this familiar, but if you don't, no problem. What you see here is actually from our own data that we built from over 100 survey years from existing data from about 1970 through about 2018. And this is trust and confidence in the president or the White House, depending on the question wording. And the really familiar result here is that opinion on the president depends on the party of the president and the party of the respondent. And so Republican respondents are in red, Democratic identifying respondents are in blue. And you see that under Republican presidents, Republican respondents are much more trusting and confident in the president than are Democrats. And under Democratic presidents, it is the opposite. Democrats are much more confident and trusting than Republicans. So that's one pattern to look at as it goes through time. But the other is that that gap is getting wider. The gap under Ford was not as big as it was under Reagan, and that was not as big as it was under Obama and Trump. And if anything, trust and confidence in the president is going down over time. So we're going to look at this sort of phenomenon among ostensibly apolitical institutions, where the president is a political institution. It has a clear partisan valence attached to it. So as we move on in the presentation, it's going to be important that we have we've clarified some definitions. So what do we mean by an institution? For the purposes of our project, an institution means a set of organizations. Let's say that we're talking about colleges and universities with people in roles. So perhaps that could mean college professors who are acting collectively through an individual organization like a college or a university to address a basic societal need like education. They commit structured activity based on things like regulations, norms, understandings, etc. And these institutions persist and reproduce themselves. Now, I've said several things there that people who study institutions will recognize as things we could call institutions. We could refer to these roles that people fill as institutions. We could refer to individual organizations as institutions. We could certainly refer to regulations, norms, and understandings as institutions. But for our purposes, we're going to use the word institution to mean a set of organizations. So if we say schools, we mean all schools. If we say colleges and universities, we mean all colleges and universities. So what do we mean by a non-political or apolitical institution? This could be a non-governmental, profit or nonprofit organization, or it could be a governmental institution that is not clearly political. It doesn't have a clear partisan valence attached to it. Things like the police, the military, K-12 schools, obviously many colleges and universities, but not all of them. And why is trust important in institutions? Well, it's important because these institutions need legitimacy to survive, and trust or confidence provides some forms of legitimacy. And it does this in a few different ways. Our paper expands on this greatly, and so we won't go into it in great detail here, but there are different forms of legitimacy, and trust affects several of them. Okay, so the next slide, please. So our existing data from those roughly 100, I think it's 111, survey years comes from three different polls. The Harris poll, starting in the late 60s, actually, this General Social Survey starting in 1972, and Gallup starting in 1973. And there are two different forms of this confidence question that we use to indicate trust. We're going to lump these together as if these two question forms are equivalent. We think they are close enough to be equivalent. But to be clear, the Harris and GSS question is, as far as people in charge of running, let's say, colleges and universities are concerned, would you say you have a great deal of confidence, only some confidence, or hardly any confidence at all in them? And then the Gallup question is, please tell me how much confidence you yourself have in each one of these that they're about to list. A great deal, quite a lot, some, or very little. So the Harris and GSS wording concentrates on the people running the institution. Gallup only asks about the institution itself, and they have different numbers of answer categories. But we lump these together and we use them in one cohesive data set, therefore using them as equivalent to each other. Next slide. Yeah. So this is the first of three slides that are going to show you which polling house, which poll or survey we get which institutions from, and a little bit of detail about the various question wording. So I'll just walk you through the first slide a little bit more deliberately, and then we'll move quickly through the next two. If you look at the presidency line, the second line on this table, you see it belongs to this group of highly politicized governmental institutions: Congress, the presidency, the executive departments, Supreme Court. And you see, as you move through the columns, We have a question about the presidency from Gallup. We don't have a question about this from the GSS, and we have a question about the White House from Harris. Whereas we have questions about the executive departments and the executive branch of the federal government from GSS and Harris, respectively. And so each of those institutions we have from 2 sources. The other 2 on this page we have from 3 sources. The next slide shows you, here we have a group of relatively neutral institutions, medicine, law, television. You can see where we get those questions from. And then this existing economic cleavage, which was already somewhat polarized, noticeably polarized before our data set begins, really before these questions begin to be asked by these major polls, which include big business, banks, and organized labor. And the next slide shows you a social cleavage that we think is emerging. We think we show in this project that it's emerging. It has 2 different parts of it, sort of a norms and rules-based portion where institutions like the military, organized religion, police, and the criminal justice system are moving one direction, with Republicans much more likely to trust those institutions than Democrats. And then a knowledge and information part of this cleavage made up of the press, science, and education moving in the opposite direction. It's more likely to be trusted by Democrats than by Republicans. Next slide, please. And so this slide is the first of 2 that illustrate this visually. So on this graph, if an institution falls on the purple diagonal line, then trust among Democrats and among Republicans are the same. And so if an institution had no difference in trust between adherents to each party, we would expect it to fall on the purple line. Now you can see that law, for example, pretty much falls directly on the line, but we've allowed for a margin here, and we're just gonna highlight the institutions that fall outside the margin. So this slide shows you in 1974 that trust among Democrats and Republicans was quite different for organized labor, where Democrats are, so if it falls above to the left of that blue dotted line, that's considerably more trusted by Democrats than by Republicans. And if it falls on the bottom or right of the red dotted line, that's significantly more trusted by Republicans than by Democrats. And that is where business, usually the wording there is large corporations. That's where that falls. If we fast forward 40 years and look at this same graph again, then we see many institutions have run away in different directions from that purple line. We don't have very many nearly equivalent institutions. Medicine is very close to being equally trusted. I mean, for all intents and purposes, it is equally trusted by Republicans and Democrats. Keep in mind, we don't have data, even when we show you new data later in this presentation, it is not new enough to capture during COVID-19. So perhaps now with what's happened, medicine would not fall near that line. But as of 2014, very few institutions were near the purple line. And on the left, more trusted by Democrats than by Republicans, organized labor has been joined by the press broadly and TV news, and then K-12 education and higher education. And big business has been joined on the other side, more trusted by Republicans than by Democrats, by organized religion and the military. And you can see that not very many are left near the purple line. And then we show you, just to illustrate the movement here, and I would most want to point out the movement in higher education. It's sort of near the top middle of this. I don't think I have a cursor that can show this to you, but near the top middle of this diagram, you see that higher education has moved significantly to the left. So it's come outside of those margins, but moving directly to the left like that means that on the vertical axis, trust among Democrats, it hasn't really moved. And on the horizontal axis, trust among Republicans, it's decreased quite a lot. And we'll be able to show you a figure that basically demonstrates that exact thing over the last 10 years in a couple slides. You see that the one thing that moved there to the right is military on the right. Sorry about that. Okay. So we have 3 basic patterns of change here. Television is an example of an institution that wasn't polarized in the early 1970s and really isn't polarized now. And the next pattern of change, business is an example, started out polarized in the early 1970s, and it is still polarized now, but it hasn't become a lot more polarized. And then organized religion is an example of the third pattern of change, and higher education would be the pattern of could be inverted, basically, where there was basically no polarization in the early 1970s. By the 1990s, it emerged, and certainly by the late 2000 teens, so in the last several years, there is very significant polarization between the parties, where Republicans have not really gotten less trusting in organized religion, but Democrats have fallen off a cliff. And if we had higher education there, you would see basically the inverse, where Democrats stay about the same and Republicans fall off a cliff. So we're going to show you a big table, which hopefully, because we're actually not in a conference hall or the library, you will be able to see it because it's on your own screen. But we're going to show you a table with lots of regression results. So we have this regression model, multiple regression models, where we're going to show you three basic columns, sort of a super column on the left about initial partisan and ideological difference in confidence and trust. So that's the initial political difference. Then the trend in trust over time, usually that's negative, not for everything, but usually. And then the trend in partisan and ideological difference over time that is owed to party ID and also to ideology, self-identified ideology. Those are going to be in a super column on the right. And we're going to highlight substantively important results in yellow. Not every statistically significant result is going to be in yellow because we have something like 120 or 150,000 respondents. But we're going to, we've standardized everything -1 to 1, and any result, any coefficient over 0.1 absolute value, we're going to highlight. And so I'll show you the next. Yep. So here's the table, and we're going to identify these three patterns of change. So in the top group of rows above, between these red lines, you see the apolitical institutions, the non-political institutions like medicine, law, and television. We don't highlight much of anything in this top left quadrant because they were not polarized to begin with. You see the negative trend in the middle. They're all, the red numbers indicate a negative trend. And then on the right, we don't have many significant results here either. And this means that they have not polarized very much at all. So they weren't polarized to begin with. They haven't polarized much by the end. The second group under that is that existing economic cleavage. We see some significant polarization to begin with, but not a lot of polarization over time. That's why we don't highlight much in yellow on the right. And then two parts of this emerging social cleavage with sort of the rules and order group, military, religion, police, criminal justice. You don't see really any significant polarization to begin with, but a lot of polarization over time. That's why the column for party and ideology in the sort of right-hand part of that is highlighted so much. And then the models identify very little polarization, even in this knowledge and information oriented group, part of the social cleavage, press, TV news, science, education, very little to begin with. The trend overwhelmingly is negative. And then there's been a lot of polarization over time, and we can label these for you in the next couple slides. We're going to overlay them and then take away the numbers. And so you see these three patterns of change that we identified. Apolitical institutions, little initial political difference, little change over time. The economic cleavage, significant initial political difference, initial being, the early 1970s when we start having data, and then little change over time. And then two parts of the social cleavage, order and norms, there's no initial political difference and a big change over time where Republicans end up more favorable, more trusting than Democrats. And the knowledge and information portion, press, science, education, where there is some initial but relatively little and inconsistent political difference, and then big changes over time where Democrats are more favorable and more trusting than are Republicans. Finally, before I turn it over to Henry, I just want to show you some newer data that we have from Pew. So we got 5 surveys that they share publicly, and the respondent number, the N on these is very large. Some of these points are based on over 10,000 respondents. And you see, this is just for higher education, for colleges and universities. This is a slightly different question. This isn't confidence or trust exactly, but the vertical axis is the percent of each of these groups that say that colleges and universities have a positive effect on America. And you see that the proportion of Democrats, if anything, is going a little bit up, 70% to maybe 75% from 2010 to 2019. But you see that Republicans are falling off a cliff. They used to be nearly 60% saying that colleges and universities have a positive effect on America. And by 2019, about 30% said that. And I'll hand it over to Henry.
Thanks, Brad. So we were startled by these findings, is the only way to describe it, because it just seemed astonishing to us. We weren't completely surprised because we knew that in American politics, we'd moved from politics that was very much based upon the New Deal cleavage, which was all about economics, so the division between labor and business. And we knew that starting in the 1970s, there'd been more and more emphasis upon a cleavage that had to do with social norms, with social values, with culture, sometimes called the social issues. So it wasn't completely surprising to see that religion, the police, military, institutions like that had gone in one direction, and that institutions like the press, higher education, and science had gone in another direction. But we were still worried that maybe the findings were artifacts of something else going on. Perhaps it's possible that people just had decided that these institutions, it's not that they were too partisan or that they were representing one party more than another. It's rather that people in a given party started to think bad things about these institutions. So, for example, they might think that higher education was too costly, and perhaps Republicans thought that more than Democrats thought that. So we wanted to ask about particular characteristics of these institutions and whether or not those characteristics and which characteristics had an impact on people's evaluations of their confidence or trust in them. So we did a study in 2019 in the fall using the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, where we got 1,000 respondents. And we wanted to see if we would replicate the findings from the overtime confidence data set. And then we asked a whole bunch of questions about the qualities of institutions. So we asked, do they cost too much? Do they indoctrinate people? Do they do good work? Are they important? We also asked a separate question about perceptions of partisanship and ideology. So we asked, about how many Republicans do you think are college professors? Most of them about equal Democrats and Republicans, or very few Republicans, that kind of thing. And then we also wanted to ask another question, not only what might have caused these differences, but also what the implications might be. So we asked whether or not people would be happy to have some kin of theirs who was, say, a college professor, and whether they'd like to have some kin of theirs marry a college professor or be a college professor. So these are the details of the questions. I'm not going to go through them. I've already mentioned the questions. We use 7-point Likert scales for the institution does good work, is important, and so forth. For politicization of the institution, we asked about the partisan composition and the ideological composition. And then finally, we asked, how would you feel about your child or the child of someone close to you marrying a person who identifies as a college professor? Or how would you feel about your child or someone close one to you being a college professor? So first of all, did we get the same results with respect to polarization? And the answer is we did. And we even have another institution here, police, that we added, although sadly we didn't do the follow-up questions on police, which we now wish we had done. But what you see here is a plot where Democrats, independents, and Republicans are along the bottom. And this is the mean confidence for each institution. And you can see that, for example, for the military, which is the dotted blue line, as you go from being a Democrat to an independent to a Republican, you get more and more confident in the military. You get more and more confident in the police. You get more and more confident in religion. On the other hand, if you're a Democrat, you're less confident in science, public schools, colleges, or the press than Republicans. So these are almost identical to our earlier results. So we replicated those results. We also get the same results for ideology, for whether people are self-described liberals, moderates, or conservatives. These are some data we didn't collect, but I thought you'd be interested in them. So is there any evidence that Americans believe higher education has a political tilt? Well, this comes from a Pew study in 2018. And in 2018, when asked a question, do majority of Americans say politics on college campuses have a political tilt? Percent saying that politics on campuses have a Republican tilt. 72% of Republicans say it has a tilt, and 48% of Democrats say it has a tilt. And among those see the particular leaning, it turns out it's really Republicans who are worried about it. This is consistent with what you may remember we saw before, that Republicans are the people who have really fallen off in their trust and confidence in higher education. So here's another way of asking the same question. Do you have confidence that college professors will act in the public interest? And you see here that Republicans do not have confidence that college professors will act in the public interest, but Democrats do have confidence that college professors will act in the public interest. So these data are part of what motivated us to do the study where we actually looked at all the institutions and asked similar questions. So I'm just going to skip that one. So one question we asked is, we asked people, did the institution indoctrinate people? And then we break it down by the answers from Democrats, independents, and Republicans. And you can see that Republicans, big time, think that colleges and journalism, and by the way, notice the parallel line and the essentially almost overlapping lines for colleges and journalism. Republicans believe colleges and journalism indoctrinate people about equally compared to Democrats. Science is behind colleges and journalism. People don't think science indoctrinates quite as much, but notice the big partisan difference between estimates of how much science indoctrinates people. And then look at religion in the military. So these are some data, and the really important thing is look at the right-hand side. We look at Republican minus Democratic ratings on 4 qualities. The 4 qualities are whether people think the institution does good work, whether it's important, whether it costs too much, or indoctrinates. And what we find is big Democratic bias for labor. People evaluate the qualities of labor much more positively. Democrats evaluate the qualities of labor much more positively. And they also evaluate the qualities of the press, science, and higher education much more positively than Republicans. On the other hand, Republicans evaluate the qualities of military and the religion much more positively. So this gets at the question of, are some of the reasons why maybe the various party members feel differently about institutions due to the fact that they have different evaluations of the qualities of the institutions? Then we had the question of, well, what matters more? The qualities that people see in the institutions, or the fact that they believe the institution is politically polarized? So this looks at the partisan composition of institutions, and then we're going to put everything together in a regression equation and try to see what seems to matter most. But what you find here is that highly religious people are assumed to be Republican, as are military generals. College professors and journalists are assumed to be Democrats. And indeed, there's a big difference between Democrats and Republicans on how they evaluate college professors and journalists. There's not such a big difference with respect to scientists and labor union members between the two parties, but scientists and labor union members are considered to be mostly Democratic. Bankers, again, not so much difference, a little bit, but they're mostly considered to be nearer the middle of the diagram, and there is some partisan difference, but not as much as for highly religious people. So let's put this all together in a regression. And basically the important thing here to note is that when we take trust in some institutions and regress it on the qualities to try to discern how much the qualities matter, and also on the perceived partisan composition, we find that in fact, the perceived partisan composition matters a lot for the press, science, and higher education. It also matters somewhat for medicine, banks, and labor, but really matters a lot for press, science, and higher education. The qualities also have a role to play, as you can see there in the oblong at the bottom, that the indoctrination question picks up a bunch of effect. But of course, the indoctrination question, that's a quality, but that actually gets to some extent, again, at the question of the partisan composition of these institutions. So the net result of our study was to conclude that, yes, it's true that, for example, costing too much is a quality that people ascribe to higher education, and that causes them to trust it less. But really what seems to be driving most of the result is not how much something costs, not how important it seems to be in terms of the job it does, but really whether or not it indoctrinates people and whether it's perceived to be of the opposite party. So that led us to the question of, well, what difference does this make? Should we care? And what we do here is we have happiness with having kin closely associated with various groups. So down the left-hand side are all sorts of different groups. And we added here, by the way, groups such as a gay person or an atheist. And what we find here is that doctors are most liked as kin, not a big surprise. Business people are way up there, banker, soldier. But look down towards the bottom. Having somebody of the opposite party is least liked by people, and you have a coefficient that's very large for both Democrats and Republicans. So the partisan difference, if you look at the right-hand column, is greatest for parties. It's also large for stigmatized groups, gay people being liked less by Republicans than by Democrats. Same thing with atheists. But it's still significant for some institutions. Indeed, about half the size of what we see for the partisan differences. That is to say that, yes, Republicans don't want their daughter, say, to marry a Democrat, but they also don't want their daughter to marry a journalist or a professor. And Democrats don't want their daughter to marry a religious person. There's smaller effects for soldiers, police people, and scientists. So we're finding replicated in decisions about who your children or kin should associate with in terms of marriage or actually become a member of a profession of, we find that associated with partisan differences. This is worrisome because it suggests that we have a society which is really breaking apart in fundamental ways. So what are our conclusions? Well, this is primarily an exploratory and descriptive paper, but there are some data which are so powerful that you really don't need to have a lot of detailed causal information before you start saying something really significant is going on here. The overtime changes are too big. The material that we've shown you from our survey is too strong, that partisan differences make a difference, that we really now believe that we now have a group of once apolitical, but now highly politicized institutions. The press, higher education, and science, which is, those institutions are liked more by Democrats than Republicans, and the military, police, and religion, and those institutions are liked more by Republicans than by Democrats. So the knowledge and information institutions are on one side, and the social order and norms institutions are on the other side. These are fundamental institutions for any society. They're the institutions that keep a society together by providing information about what's true, what's factual, what knowledge is, or by what are the proper ways to conduct yourself, are the proper ways to police and to protect a society. So we talked about the factors that matter. I'm not going to go over those again. It does turn out that qualities such as cost do tend to matter, but perceived partisan composition matters a great, great deal. And furthermore, the implications of the polarization of trust are that respondents are unfavorable towards kinship relations with members of institutions whose perceived politicization is incongruent with their own political views. We're having a splintering of America. These results may help explain current social movements, think of what's going on in America right now, attitudes towards the police, think about attitudes towards science, think about attitudes even towards medicine, which is why we wonder whether medicine is still an apolitical institution, and that if we redid our study today, whether we would find it is also starting to become polarized. It certainly matters a lot for higher education. And since this is the Center for Studies in Higher Education talk, let me say that at least as an educator, I'm very worried when I look at these data. They suggest to me that Americans don't have the trust they once had in higher education. That suggests they're going to be less likely to provide funding for it, and they're going to be less likely to believe the college professors when they get on television, if they happen to be Republicans, than they once did. And that we have just a vast difference of opinion between Republicans and Democrats about the believability and the utility of higher education. And so the net result is we worry that fundamental social problems are going to be harder to solve because of this kind of polarization. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Henry and Brad. This was an extremely interesting talk, and we have a number of questions that have come in through the chat function. And for those of you in the audience, it's not too late. If you have questions, please feel free to send those questions via the chat function on YouTube. So let me begin with a question that has to do with differences. The question is whether or not you see differences in your results, or whether you've been able to look for differences in your results based upon either the economic background of respondents or the ethnic background of respondents.
So, so we, in all this data that we collected, over about 50 years, over 100 surveys, the common demographic qualities that we have across all surveys is quite limited. However, we do almost always, like nearly universally, have income, education, and race. And so we actually tried to build a model to explain this based more on socioeconomic standing using education and income, and just didn't get a lot of explanatory power with that. So the basic findings that we've shown you today are robust to including those, and they're also robust to including race. We haven't shown you that in the presentation, but we don't have as much data in the existing data set as you might like. We don't have lots of interesting demographic stuff that we might ask in our own data, but we have enough to basically answer that question. We can run models that include that, and the basic findings that we've presented are robust to those questions.
To put that another way, that once you put party identification in ideology, liberal conservative ideology, in a regression equation, basically almost nothing else matters. Now, it is probably the case, in fact, it is the case, that ideology and partisan identification are related to those socioeconomic factors. So we know, for example, that a large fraction of African Americans vote Democratic. But once you put party identification in the equation, the rest of the variables just don't matter that much.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question I noticed in your presentation about knowledge and the change in attitude toward the press or other knowledge groups, that you had data in 2014 that already showed a significant change from the 1970s. So it wasn't all in the last 4 years, for example. Can you say a little bit more about how these coefficients, or how this level of trust has changed over time? Has it been steady degradation, or has it been in jumps?
It looks pretty steady. I mean, it really varies by institution a bit, but if you actually look at the plots, you may remember that we showed you one plot for religion where it looked very steady over time. The same thing is true for higher education. There's a few institutions, like banking has gone up and down in crazy ways, but of course, banking is implicated in the 2008-9 and earlier downturns and also scandals. So banking seems unusual in that regard. But for most of the institutions, it seems to have been a slow but steady increase in partisan polarization, in trust in them since the 1970s. And that's in keeping with what we see politically, which is increasing polarization and party identification within the electorate.
Thank you. So I have to ask you, and we've gotten some questions as well on, there's two obvious institutions who right now are facing some issues about trust and changing trust. One is the Supreme Court of the United States, and the other is the Center for Disease Control. And would you like to comment on either or both of those institutions?
Well, we don't have those data for certainly for CDC. We do for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, if you look at it over time, has not really had exactly the same amount of up and down that you see with the presidency that we showed you at the very beginning, because it's harder for people to get a really good fix on exactly what the partisanship or the ideology is of the Supreme Court. However, one of the things it seems to me that the Supreme Court is risking in the moves that have been going on in the last decade or so is becoming increasingly politicized. You might date it, in fact, from the Gore versus Bush decision, where the Supreme Court seemed to be more political than it had been heretofore. Although you could go back maybe to the Bork nomination if you want to go back that far, where the politicization of the court maybe really started. But it's been a long time coming. It's been fairly slow, but I do think that given what's been happening to these apolitical institutions, it seems that the Supreme Court has to worry about these things. Similarly, it's hard to believe right now that there might not be some partisan differences with respect to views of CDC. We certainly know there's big partisan differences with respect to mask wearing.
Yeah, I wanted to say there's another question I think you guys passed on in the chat here. Does this apply to other civic organizations, like the basic trend that we've seen here? And I would lump the CDC question and that question kind of together in that our level of analysis was sets of organizations, right? So technically we could say, well, CDC is included in the executive department of the federal government, so we have questions about that, et cetera. But it's a fascinating question that we just don't have data to bring to bear about whether we would see this trend in about something like the CDC specifically, or pick your favorite civic organization. We might very well. It probably depends on whether elite signaling has attached salient partisan valence to these things. And so if people are beginning to see the CDC as partisan, as totally captured by, say, the president and whatever party the president is, then we just think that what CDC says is in line with that, then we would expect that kind of polarizing public opinion on it. But we do not have data to begin to answer that question.
Somebody in the chat also asked the hard causal question of how come we run trust on some of the qualities and the perceived partisanship instead of, in effect, doing the opposite, especially maybe the qualities on trust. And the answer is yes, these things are probably jointly determined. That's why I think the over time data are also incredibly important, because they show you what's going on over time. We are very clear in the paper we've written on this that these are descriptive results. We wouldn't say that they're deeply causal. On the other hand, when you look over time at what's happened with trust, it's hard to believe that something's not going on. Now, it could be, of course, that trust and feelings about trust are driving the qualities, yes, but that still leaves you with the problem of these institutions having vastly different ratings from Democrats and Republicans with respect to qualities. It could also possibly be that trust is driving perceived partisanship, but that's a little harder argument to make, and it seems a little more convoluted to me. It certainly is unlikely that trust is driving actual partisanship, so that to the degree that we got information on people's actual reported partisanship, we doubt whether that's really being affected by trust over time. But it's conceivable that perceptions of the partisanship of the institution are being driven by their actual partisanship over time. But again, you still then lead to the same problem. You've got institutions that are perceived to be highly partisan. So take your pick.
Great. Thank you. Well, let me ask you another question from the chat, which is similar to one that was asked earlier. And that is, are the partisan differences in trust a reflection of the realignment of the composition of the parties? You've used the Republican versus Democrat as the key independent variable in a sense. But the questioner points out that suburbs are becoming more democratic and non-college whites are becoming more Republican. So there has been some realignment within the parties in terms of different groups in society. Would you like to comment on that?
In another paper, Brad and I have explored questions having to do with the changes in the alignment of the parties. And one of the most interesting things there is that once upon a time, when you thought of Republicans, you thought of people of high socioeconomic status, by which you meant they have high income and they have high education. And Democrats had lower socioeconomic status. They tend to be working class, so they had less education and lower income. It turns now we have a really odd and surprising result, which is that Republicans are now the party that have people who have more income than you would expect given their education. Think of the small business owner. The person who started a small business is doing pretty well financially, at least until recently, but doesn't have much education, maybe didn't complete college. Democrats are the party of people who have more education than you'd expect given their income. Think of the social welfare worker who has a master's degree, maybe even a doctorate, but doesn't really make a lot of money. This, by the way, leads to stereotypes. The Democrats are overeducated and don't know how to make money, and the Republicans know how to make money but are undereducated. And these stereotypes are adrift and out there in the world and have an impact on people, how people perceive the two parties. And there is some truth to the stereotypes in terms of the data. And I think that's another thing that's pushing apart America in a very profound way and leading to problems. And you can see, by the way, that if you have a group, the Democrats, who have more education than you'd expect given their income, they would like maybe the knowledge producing institutions. You could see how if you have people who have more income than you'd expect given their education, then maybe they'd be more happy with the discipline-oriented kinds of institutions, like religion, police, and the military. So I can't say that I've worked out or that we've worked out all those details, but there's something like that going on that's changing the nature of American politics. And Mr. Trump's base really is very much folks who are really moved on that dimension, so that they really have more income than you'd expect given their education.
Okay. Well, we just got a question, which is an interesting one. Does trust matter? For example, or in what ways does it matter? For example, do we think that the children of Americans who do not trust higher education are less likely to go to college?
I'm going to let Brad answer that one, since he's nearer those kinds of decisions than I am.
So fascinating question, and one that we've sort of asked each other in discussions. I mean, I don't mean to take a cop out of all these interesting questions. I don't know that we have quite the right data to answer that. I suspect that we are getting to a point, or maybe we are already to a point, where if you ask a parent, would they aspire to have their child go to certain very famous coastal colleges, things like maybe Harvard, Berkeley, Stanford, something like that, that they might, some people, depending on their self-identified ideology or party, might say no. I don't know that we're to the point where if you ask somebody in, a Republican, a conservative Republican in Kansas, would you aspire to have your son or daughter go to the University of Kansas, that they would say no. I think it's very possible that those answers are different. But, I considered using a slide in this presentation of Louis Gohmert, a member of the House, saying, I'm not going to get this quite right, but mommies and daddies, if you love America, don't let your children go to Harvard, I think is what he said, or Harvard Law School. So like there are elite signals coming down to especially Republicans, that there are some coastal institutions that are just brainwashing people, and that you shouldn't want your children to go to them. I don't know if that would result broadly in fewer people going to college, because I'm not sure that it's universal for college. They might just not aspire to have their children move away very far and go to a specific kind of institution. And also, I mean, part of that decision will be maybe up to the parents, but part of it will be up to the children, right? So whatever causal pressure there is there will be somewhat muted by the child becoming an adult and making their own decisions about that. It could be passed down in a couple different ways. It could be that the financial responsibility is partly on the parent and they partly make the decision. It could be that they instill those values in the child, but like partly children get to make those decisions for themselves at that point. I wonder if I could respond to one that I saw come through in the chat. I think there was a follow-up on civic organizations, and I think we have an interesting answer to this. So I think in follow-up to the question about does this apply to civic organizations, somebody asked, I'm asking more with Bowling Alone in mind, Bob Putnam's book about civic organizations kind of dying off. Does your research reinforce its lament or change it in another direction? So I think that at a top line level, it probably kind of reinforces it, or maybe partly explains why civic voluntarism might be going down, I guess, one possible explanation, although it's not Putnam's explanation. But social capital theory, which Putnam is included in, basically argues that as social capital declines, then trust in government should decline, because social capital is an important part of democratic values. And if democratic values are declining, then trust in government should go down. It seems to me that we might be talking about a slightly different causal model where trust in these social institutions, which are not governmental, it might be like that causal stream, is, social capital goes down, democratic values go down, trust in government goes down. What if the polarization in government has sort of looped around and ended up causing a decline in social capital? I think we haven't fully thought through this. We don't have a paper that dwells on this too heavily, but I think it's possible that we might end up arguing that we've missed a step in that causal model.
Great, thank you. So another question that's come in, let me rephrase it, is that you show that trust in certain groups, namely Republicans in higher education, has declined significantly over the years. And in particular, with regard to higher education, do you see things that we can do as purveyors of higher education that would help butter or change that trend to renew trust in higher education?
To my mind, one of the most important things we have to continue to do, and I think we are doing it, I know here at Berkeley, Chancellor Carol Christ has really been focused on it, is to make sure that we make it clear that all perspectives, all viewpoints will be discussed in the academy, that we're not going to say that certain perspectives can't be taught or can't be discussed.
Uh-oh.
I think we just lost Henry in mid-sentence.
Yeah. So I think I'll jump off of that and also say, in addition to trying to relate to people that these institutions will, try to assure people that they'll deal fairly with information and consider all perspectives. Some of the solutions for affective polarization and polarization in general are challenging to think about how we would implement, but they exist. For example, there's good work showing that direct social contact between people of different partisan persuasions can sometimes often does lower affective polarization attitudes toward those outgroups. And so, if people are getting a highly stereotyped vision of what a college professor or a coastal university is like, if they somehow have direct contact with people in those institutions or the institutions themselves, they're likely to have some of those stereotypes broken down. So it's possible that that would help. It is difficult to imagine how we systematically, administer contact with Berkeley professors or Harvard professors or whatever to people, for example, that maybe haven't gone to college, who live in the middle of the country. or even people who, you know, live in Sacramento and don't want to drive to Berkeley and talk to somebody. So, I mean, personally, I'm considering how to apply that research and see if it would work in these contexts. But I have to say, I agree with those who criticize it as not a solution that's likely to be instituted widely enough to fix the problem.
Great, thank you. Henry, you were cut off in mid-sentence. Do you want to?
No, Brad, as usual, finished my sentences better than I could, so I appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah, something happened. Who knows? The gremlins.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both. We're just about out of time, and we're just about out of questions. But I think that this has been an extremely eye-opening presentation, and something that it's certainly thought-provoking, and is certainly a statement about how our society has evolved over the last 40 or 50 years in terms of attitudes. And I think that it's extremely valuable. And I want to thank both of you for making this presentation. On behalf of the Center for Studies in Higher Education, I think this is a very, very, very valuable contribution. So thank you all. And to those out there, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.